Perfect. Right on cue. I like it. All right. So welcome everyone to I think it's the last Friday talk of the semester. So we made it, or at least we almost made it. So congrats on that. So for those that don't know me, my name is Erika Gallegos. I'm an assistant professor in the systems engineering department, and I'm going to walk you through today a guide on how to conduct literature review, and more than just that, how to actually synthesize a literature review for actual research impact, as opposed to just regurgitating what you read and not necessarily synthesizing and providing that critical analysis that we look for in graduate work. So let's start with some motivation on why we're spending an hour to talk about this content today. So as a graduate student, it's part of the task that you have to complete is reading literature, understanding that literature, and building upon the literature to show value on what you are contributing. And more than that, you have to explain how your work is grounded, but also differs and is novel from the existing and established findings and methods. And this is traceable, so it's not like you can avoid doing this. There are actual research outputs that require you to demonstrate this expertise in doing a literature review. And so if you're a master's student, you have to write a thesis. If you're a PhD student, you have to write a dissertation. And then many of those also require a journal or a conference paper as well. And so in your dissertation or your thesis, you have to have a literature review background section. You also have to provide an introduction in a journal article or conference proceeding. So there is like products that actually require this. And I put this, Twitter post up here because I think oftentimes it can feel like this is what we're doing in a literature review, and we want to get over that hurdle of thinking about it from this lens, right? So if we read through this, this person says the most annoying part of academic writing is knowing the thing but looking for some other paper to say it for you. You can't just say bread is soft. You have to say, according to Baker 2001, bread is soft. But then you can't quote Baker 2001 because that is outdated. And although bread did not stop being soft since 2001, you have to find another Baker 2023 that said that bread is soft. And so I wanted to also put it in the context of where literature review might fit in some of your research products. And so this is a typical flow of a journal article. Not necessarily all journal articles, but this is a traditional flow. And I know this is a little small font, but I'll talk you through what's the important part of this, right? So we start with the abstract. It's even too small for me to read the font here. But right, it provides the problem statement, a brief introduction to methodology, your main findings, and then the principal conclusions. And then you dive into the introduction. And if you hooked people with the abstract, you want to make sure you're still hooking them with the introduction. Otherwise, you're going to lose them entirely. And so the introduction is important, right? You want to establish a territory. You want a brief on what's already been done in this space. You want to establish a niche. You want to talk about, what are the conflicting findings? What are the gaps? What have people already done? What are the theoretical frameworks that support your work? And then you want to occupy that niche by specifying what they're about to read in the paper that you're setting them up to read. And then, of course, the next section is methodology, results. And then in the discussion, there's oftentimes a callback to the literature to say how your results, compare or contrast to what's already been established. So you can find, largely it's that introduction we're thinking about, but still as well as in the discussion. So I wanted to start it off with some general tips, and then we will dive into, synthesizing it all together into like what a paragraph might look like. So let's start with, I think we have 5 tips that we're going to walk through. And I will go into more depth of each of these, and then we'll have an opportunity to see how well we retained these 5 different concepts. So the first common mistake in conducting and writing a literature review is copying direct quotes. I think that's the most common one that I run across on my students. And that's, I think I got tired of editing out quotes from so many literature reviews that I read that was the motivation for me wanting to do this talk so that I wouldn't have to keep, reading papers that just had direct quotes in them. So instead, you should be paraphrasing and synthesizing what you're reading, putting it in your own words, and we'll talk about what that means. An unintegrated list of studies without providing that critical analysis and how that flow should be. relying on just one source or over relying on one source, as opposed to bringing in multiple voices to the section. Providing just a summary only and not providing a critical critique of, how that relates to what your actual application is. And then the last one is patch writing, which is, basically if you just modify a couple of words and you don't actually reframe the entire thought into your own words. So let's walk through each of these. So the first one is direct quotes versus synthesizing. And so the idea here is that you should combine ideas from sources and express them in your own words to create a coherent argument or explanation. And so what we should not be doing is just taking a direct quote and not, rephrasing it in the context of how you're applying it. So my example here is, Ahmed 2024 states the performance of battery systems degrades significantly under extreme temperatures. Like, yeah, that is true. But if someone wanted to read that reference, they would just go to Ahmed 2024 and read that paper. And you need to provide, your own spin on it, talk about why it has value in the context of your paper. And also, a quick way for a desk rejection is just a literature review that has a bunch of direct quotes and you're not reframing it in your own thought. And so a better way to approach this would be to synthesize the writing. So you could say Ahmed 2024 found that battery system performance deteriorates notably when exposed to extreme temperatures, a finding consistent with other studies linking temperature effects to reduced operational efficiency. Right now, you're telling the reader that I'm giving you this quote because I'm trying to help you make that connection that temperature has an effect on battery efficiency. And that is the reference that supports that claim. The next example was listing versus building a logical flow, right? The idea here is that you should be linking related research findings to show relationships, trends, or developments across studies. And so the example here, what not to do, which is just list disconnected studies and not make the connection on why you're putting them all together in one paragraph. Right, so an example here would be Lopez 2023 studied battery materials, Wong 2019 examined thermal effects on batteries, and Patel 2020 focused on battery lifespan. Like, good job not doing direct quotes, but it doesn't necessarily connect them to tell that overall story. So instead, right, you could reframe this to say recent research has explored multiple facets of battery degradation. Lopez 2023 highlighted the role of material selection, while Wong 2019 demonstrated the thermal effects further accelerate performance losses. Building on these findings, Patel 2020 investigated how these combined factors ultimately shorten overall battery lifespan. Right now, you're providing some context on why these studies are related and why you're putting them together and walking the reader through, looking through what those past studies have found. I would say the second most common thing I see is over relying on one source as opposed to integrating multiple references, right? Providing more merit because multiple people have found similar findings. And so in this context, we want to draw on evidence from several authors to provide a more balanced and comprehensive understanding of the topic. So what not to do is to over rely on one source. So an example here would be, according to Kim 2021, autonomous vehicle sensors can fail during heavy rain. Kim also notes that algorithms struggle with low visibility conditions. Kim further states that road surface reflection confuses vision systems. Like, I'm sure Kim is, well merited to be making these claims, but what do other people say? And is Kim representative of the literature? And so instead, we should be integrating multiple sources. So example, how we could transform the left side could be sensor performance in autonomous vehicles degrades during adverse weather conditions, particularly heavy rain and fog. Kim 2021, Alvarez et al. 2025. These environmental challenges affect both the hardware through water-induced interference and the software, which struggles with low contrast visual inputs, Zhu and Robin. Right, so again, the idea, providing some context, reframing it, and saying why it matters in the context of whatever your paper might be trying to prove. The next one here is simple versus critical analysis, right? We want to go beyond summarizing by analyzing, comparing, or interpreting the significance of the research. So what not to do is only one summary, no critique. So the example here would be multiple studies show that machine learning improves predictive maintenance. Taylor, Gomez, and Abdul all said that, right? But how did they say that, and what context did they say it, and can you provide some more insights other than just machine learning improves predictive maintenance? And so we want to provide that critical analysis. So we might say, while machine learning has widely recognized for enhancing predictive maintenance, most existing models assume static operating conditions. This limitation suggests a need for developing adaptive algorithms that can handle real-world variability, right? So why did you just present this information, right? I think oftentimes when I put a quote from a reference, the next thought I have is, why did I just include that one? And I walk the reader through that. Doesn't mean every sentence needs that why after it or before it, but that can help really make that critical analysis come to play. And then I think this is my last one here, and then we'll recap these. So poor versus good paraphrasing, this idea of patch writing, right? We want to fully understand and rephrase the concepts in a new way that reflects your voice and grasps the materials. So what not to do is to basically take the quote from the reference and then just change a couple of words so that the sentence structure remains the same and that maybe it wouldn't be tagged in a plagiarism check. We do not want to do that. Right, so an example here could be the original paper could say that solar panels' efficiency declines rapidly under shading conditions due to partial energy absorption. And what we would not want to do would be to just change a couple of words, but keep the overall sentence the same. So the efficiency of solar panels drops quickly when there is shading because energy absorption is only partial, and still given credit to Zhu 2025. But you can see, you can very clearly trace that it was just some word changes there. And again, that doesn't demonstrate that you understand the literature. So instead, we should properly paraphrase. So shading significantly reduces the energy output of solar panels by limiting their ability to fully capture available light. Zhu 2025, right? So again, it's not just changing a couple words, it's reframing it in your own words to demonstrate that you understand and interpret what you just read. So someone asked a question in the chat. They said, are you saying you should never have any direct quotes in your literature review? I mean, I never say never, but I would say I don't think I have ever written a paper that has direct quotes. That just doesn't demonstrate that you understand the content. If someone wanted to know exactly what that paper said, they would be reading that paper. They're choosing to read your paper for a reason. And so you want to explain why that provides some context. And sure, sometimes you're providing a definition. And so it's, you need the definition to be in its true form from, whatever that source might be. So I would say, I'm not saying never. These are just rules of thumb, but I would heavily lean against doing that. And if you ever want to, co-author a paper with me, I will be getting rid of those direct quotes. So fair warning, I guess. All right, so why are these important, right? Again, and this kind of gets at what I just said. These papers have already been published that you're referencing in your literature review, right? And so your reader can go read that original source if that's the information they're looking for. But they specifically clicked on your paper, they stumbled on your paper using the keywords that they searched for. And so you want to demonstrate why these matter in the context of your current paper, right? So you want to use references to identify the importance of your topic, the context of your topic, why your topic is important, any theoretical frameworks that you're leveraging to collect your results or analyze your results, any contradictory findings, because this can be important. If 5 people said, one thing and 5 people said something else, that provides merit for, we still don't necessarily understand what the state of the world is. And so you are trying to resolve those conflicting opinions by using a different methodology or, carving out a different niche in the research. And ultimately, right, the end of your literature review section in an introduction should identify the gaps in the current body of knowledge and then present your research questions so that you can address those gaps and convince the reader that they should keep reading through your paper. So let's review what I just presented on and see how well we can identify some of these major flaws. So on the left side of the screen, we have, those 5 bullets that we just talked about: direct quotes versus synthesizing, unintegrated listing versus logical connections, relying on one source versus multiple sources, simple summary versus critical analysis, and patch writing versus good paraphrasing. And so if I have this example here, this is a bad example. Garcia 2020 studied supply chain risk. Singh 2021 examined supplier delays, and Chen 2022 focused on inventory shortages. So what do you all think this is an example of? Please feel free to use the chat or just shout it out. Yeah. Oh, okay, I see it. 4. I like, that's a good approach. The contrast of the outside is really hard to see behind you, but that's good. You said number 4, which is simple summary. Listing, right? Number 2, you'll notice that it's not necessarily mutually exclusive, these differences. They kind of have some blurred lines. Yeah, another one says unintegrated listing. Yeah, I think y'all are starting to converge. I would say, and I intended at least this to be an example of the unintegrated listing, right? You're just like, Garcia did this, Singh did this, Chen did this. But like, so what, right? Like, what's the flow here? Why are you presenting all these? So instead, we could say supply chain vulnerabilities have been explored from multiple angles, right? And for example, Garcia emphasized systematic risk across global networks, while Singh 21 and Chen 22 highlighted the ripple effects of supplier delays and inventory shortages, respectively. And then again, like, why? Illustrating how disruptions at one node can compromise the entire chain. Let's do another one. What about this one? What do you all think? As Brown 2020 states, artificial intelligence can greatly enhance decision-making and manufacturing by identifying patterns humans might miss. Yeah. Direct quotes, number 1. Exactly. Right? Again, that is fantastic that Brown said that, but let's rephrase that in our own words, because this is our paper that we are writing. So artificial intelligence has the potential to improve manufacturing decisions by uncovering complex patterns that may not be immediately visible to human operators. And again, still giving Brown credit. All right, let's do this next one. Solar energy adoption has increased globally in recent years due to costs and incentives. Chen, Lopez, Davis, Lin, and Ortiz. 3, 4. Anyone online want to break the tie? 4. Nice. All right, Ricardo coming in with the tiebreaker. Yeah, I would say I intended this to be an example of the simple summary versus critical analysis. We don't want to just make a claim and then throw 6 people that support that claim at the end of the sentence, and there's no traceability on how they, provided context to that. So instead, we could say, while global adoption of solar energy has accelerated due to declining costs, and Chen and Lopez investigated that, and government incentives, which Davis, Lin, and Ortiz contributed to, uneven access to financing and infrastructure in developing regions continues to hinder equitable deployment. Let's do this one too. Let's imagine the original source we found was machine learning algorithms require large data sets to perform well, especially for classification tasks. And we rewrote it in our paper to say algorithms in machine learning need big data to work properly, particularly when doing classification. 5, yeah. Yeah, exactly. Online agrees as well. Yeah, that's an example of patch writing. All I did was just change a couple words. You can very clearly see which words I changed or switched around, and it doesn't provide a new spin. It doesn't show that I understand what I just read. I just can, do some wordsmithing. And then this last one here, when 2019 argued that smart cities reduce energy usage by using data to control lighting and heating, when also explained how sensors improve traffic flow, when concluded that these benefits lead to cost savings. Nice, you guys are all experts on this now. Yeah, Number 3, relying on one source versus multiple sources. Excellent. Yeah, instead, right, and I still, quote my original author, but I add in Lopez and Kwan, and I add in Biondi et al. All right, I'll pause. Are there any questions or comments at that point? All right, cool. All right, so now I want to pivot. Now that we have a good idea of what kind of makes sense into how we critique and synthesize and reframe thoughts, how do we even get started? And I'm going to walk through a couple of examples of how I've done this with some papers with some of my students. I'm not saying this is the only way to be effective, but this is a way that has worked in some of the papers that we've approached. And you can certainly adopt this approach or do some variant of it, whatever makes sense for you. So let's talk about going from Google Scholar or whatever your search engine or book of choice is to getting that content into the document. And we're going to do it in this example here, where I was working with one of my students on a journal paper that evaluated how emotional intelligence and risk propensity influence drivers' overtaking behaviors of bicyclists and yielding behaviors towards pedestrians. And she did this using a driving simulator study. So basically, she put a bunch of people in a driving simulator. She measured their emotional intelligence using a survey. She measured their risk propensity using a survey. And then she had them drive in a city and saw how closely they got to bicyclists that they were passing, and if that changed depending on how many bicyclists there were, or if the bicyclist was wearing a helmet, or if, the bicycle was in the lane versus in the bicycle lane. And then she also threw in a couple of pedestrians waiting to cross in a mid-block cross and wanted to see if people would, yield to the pedestrians. And if there was any sort of indicator that, like, hey, you had higher emotional intelligence, maybe you were more likely to yield to a pedestrian. That was the idea behind this paper we did. And so we started it with the literature review, right? To provide merit on why we are writing a paper about this, why a research gap exists, and provide, some context on the emotional intelligence questionnaire framework that we use. We didn't develop that framework, right? So that was the idea behind our lit review. So I said this is not a Friday talk on how to actually search for literature. We've done that before. I think a couple years ago, Dr. Simsky gave a talk, a really great talk on how to find literature. So we're going to skip that step, but I still put this in here to provide a little context. Again, this is the example we're going to walk through here. This isn't a talk about how to find literature, but if, that's why you came, here you go. You can go to scholar.google.com or you can go to lib.colorstate.edu. And those are usually the two search tools that I use. And I type in some keywords and I just get, 50 to 100 papers to start with and go from there. So I would highly recommend use scholar.google.com as your primary search tool for uncovering literature. And so what might we search for, right? We just start with some keywords. If we look at this, emotional intelligence plus driving is important. Risk propensity or risk taking or riskiness and driver behavior might be some key search terms we put together, right? Like I literally would just type that into Google Scholar and open up a new tab for every paper that looks like it might be related. I might also look for safety plus bicycles, right? I'm doing this in the context of how, can I predict how close someone's going to get to a bicycle when they pass them? So I want to provide some merit on, like, we should care about bicycle safety. Bicyclists are in danger. And so this literature or this research is trying to show how we can improve bicycle safety. And similarly for pedestrian safety, right? If we want to yield to pedestrians, they have the right of way in most states. Then we want to show that there is merit that people are not properly yielding for pedestrians, for example. And so that might be some of the search terms, and I would read those papers and I would expand from there and keep searching until I, feel like I populated a good representation of the literature. And so that's, again, the step that we're kind of going over too quickly in this lecture. But what we're really interested in is once we get that stack of papers, what do we do with it? And so the first step I like to do is I open up a Word document, and as I read through the papers, I highlight some text, I copy and paste it into this Word document. And I make sure to keep track of the original source. And so I don't do a proper full citation. I just do what the DOI is. The DOI is a unique identifier. So if all you have is the DOI, you'll be able to find the original reference. So I put in the DOI and then I put in bullet points of what was interesting that I might put into my literature review. All right, again, don't worry about formatting. You'll notice this isn't pretty. The text isn't all the same. Some of these have backgrounds. There's, typos. All I'm doing is taking notes of what I think might be interesting from this paper. Right, again, copy and pasting the content that might be of interest so that I can start to pull out those key things, right? You could alternatively download the PDF and either use the electronic highlighter or a highlighter if you print out the papers. It's harder to, copy and paste it if it's a printed out version, but if that's, your workflow, by all means, please do that. Or keep track of when it's not a direct quote, because again, we don't want to misrepresent a paper and claim that their words are our own words. And so I will usually copy and paste the text so that I know I will rephrase it when I pull it into my Word document or my LaTeX document, whatever I'm writing in. But sometimes I want to provide my own, this was a driving simulator study, or this study had 50 participants and it found this. And so I'll provide, it's kind of small, but at the bottom you can see my words and then colon, and then I typed what my summary was. So you can do both, but just like the key is make sure you know which ones are direct quotes and which ones are your own thoughts, because it would be, awful if you thought that was your synthesis of the reference and you put that into your paper, because you thought that it was, and you forgot that you copied and pasted it. And then your paper is going to get desk rejected because it's going to have, an instance of plagiarism. And it was, of course, unintended, but that's still enough to get a desk rejection. Again, how many references is enough? If I'm writing a journal paper, I usually aim for 20 to 30 references. If it's a dissertation or a thesis, many, many more, like, over 100 is usually the number there. And so while you just see 2 pages here, imagine this Word document is many pages long. So once I have, gotten maybe 30 references and I'm feeling pretty good about my notes, and this isn't linear, right? You can go back to step 1 for sure. I start to organize into themes. I will look at what are some of these key themes that these papers are talking about so that I can start to think through what the structure of my lit review is going to be. Right, so I identify what those themes are and group similar articles. So here you can see I grouped a bunch of papers that had to do with bicycle passing together so that as I start to craft my paragraph or 2 paragraphs about passing bicyclists, I know, hey, these are all the references that support that. Or the one that has to do with emotional intelligence and big 5 personality traits, right? Those are all the papers that were about that. Right, and this will start to build the flow of your paper, right? You'll start big, maybe you'll talk about bicycle pedestrian safety, and then maybe you'll start talking about emotional intelligence or whatever that flavor might be for your paper. And so these themes will kind of start to, go into individual paragraphs. And as I'm pulling them, incorporating them to my paper, and I'm doing my proper synthesis and I'm doing my proper critique, right, I'm highlighting which bullet point I have pulled from so that I am not, referencing the same bullet point multiple times in my paper, for example, or I'm, getting a good idea of what papers still can be incorporated in. And so again, whatever that looks like for you, keep track of what you pulled so that you know that it's been incorporated and that work that you did to find that reference is now embedded in your paper. And not everything is going to be used, right? And it can be frustrating. You spent all that time reading a paper, but it really just didn't fit with the flow of your paper. Like, that's fine. Don't force it. That won't be the best outcome in the end. All right, I see there's a couple comments in the chat. So someone said, do you identify a topic first, then determine if that has already been researched by someone else or not? If so, you cannot do a journal article on that topic. Yeah, that's a good question. So, like, not every problem in the world has been solved every way imaginable, right? So, like, there's probably a way to recarve that niche to match what you want to do. But, like, I wouldn't write a proposal to do research, or I wouldn't start doing research until I've done a lit review to make sure that, there is merit for it. There is a need for it. And that, I don't want to, again, like reinvent the wheel. There's no need to do that. But like, there's millions probably of papers out there about driver distraction. That's a large area of research that I'm still actively in, because like there's still people driving on the road distracted, right? So we haven't really solved every aspect of distracted driving yet. And so there's usually a way to find a way to work your research in. Someone said for your dissertation, your references should only include articles that you actually cited. Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, thanks, Vinny, for answering that. Yeah, if there's no in-text citation, then yeah, you should not include it in your references. So that list of references at the end should only be things that you have in-text citations for. And yeah, like it can be frustrating because you're like, I read this paper and it was interesting. Well, it wasn't interesting enough because you didn't put it in your literature review. All right, so let's pull this all together with like, well, what goes into the paragraphs that you're actually writing. And let's do this in another example of a paper I wrote with a student. So we were interested in writing a journal paper to evaluate unintended consequences of using advanced driver assistance systems. So think adaptive cruise control or lane keeping systems, and what that effect has on driver behavior. And we did this using a driving simulator study. So we put people in a driving simulator and we had them drive, without lane keeping or adaptive cruise control. And then we turned on adaptive cruise control and lane keeping, had them drive for a little while, and then turned it off and looked at if there were any unintended consequences. Did they become a worse driver because they started to over-rely on the adaptive driving systems? And so that was the context of this study. And so in our literature review, we wanted to pull together papers that either supported this, that said, hey, people start to have compensatory behavior and maybe start texting when they're behind the wheel of an automated vehicle more, or that having automation alleviates some of the cognitive load, and now all of a sudden they're able to better, respond to pedestrians or safety critical events because they're not, just depleted by the task of driving. And so we looked to find some papers that would support these thoughts. And so this is an example paragraph from this paper, and I want to walk through some of the key concepts and how we framed, these different references. So let's dissect this. So this is the paragraph, right? So we'll just quickly read this together. Previous studies have examined driver behaviors under manual, semi-automated, and highly automated driving conditions. The effectiveness of semi-automated systems, such as adaptive cruise control, has not always been consistent. Some studies show that situational awareness and ability to detect pedestrians increase, which means better performance, for drivers when ACC is engaged. However, Root and Brown and Parker found that ACC increased response time to a hazard detection task, and that is associated with worse performance. In general, these studies suggest that the presence of ACC may alleviate some of the demands of the driving task, but that drivers may also offset the positive performance increase with more secondary task engagement. So let's dissect this paragraph. So in the very first sentence of this paragraph, you notice in our own words, without referencing anything, we provided some context on the forthcoming references. We said that there has been studies that looked under full manual, semi-autonomous, fully autonomous, looking at adaptive cruise control, but these results haven't been consistent. And so you can expect that I'm about to present to you a couple of studies that have conflicting results. And so what are those studies? Well, we have a study by Ma and Kaber that showed that adaptive cruise control increased your situational awareness. So you had a better understanding of what's going on around you. Funky, Matthews, Warm, and Emo said that people were able to better detect the presence of pedestrians when they were using adaptive cruise control. However, right, a conflicting result was that Root and Brown and Parker found that it actually increased your response time. So even though you're able to better detect them, you were slower to respond because maybe your hands were off the wheel or your feet were off the brake and accelerator pedals. And you can see, right, that's the original references, right? We can see the original reference for Ma and Kaber was that the plot reveals that on average, drivers exhibit better situational awareness when ACC control was active. Participants driving with ACC detected significantly more pedestrians than those driving without. And then compared to driving unsupported, participants located significantly more items per minute on a secondary task. with ACC, right? Again, those are the original sources. You will notice that we rephrased those to provide, why it matters in this context. And then the last sentence here, again, in our own words, explained why it matters and how it relates back to our overall objective, right? We are saying that, sure, adaptive cruise control is great. It can alleviate some of those demands of the driving task, but it may cause people to offset that positive performance with more secondary task engagement. And so that sets you up for, in this paper, we specifically dived into quantifying how much secondary task engagement our drivers did when they were using semi-autonomous technology, and then after it was taken away from them, right? So you get an idea of how we're starting to carve out like how we are answering a gap in the literature. A bad example would be if I said I reviewed some books and websites. Researchers have studied how vehicle automation impacts driving behavior. Some research shows automation improves driver behavior, while others shows automation has an adverse effect on driver behavior. Right, so what is not great about this? There's a lot that's not great about this. What do y'all think?
No citation.
Yeah, there's no citations. That's a fantastic start. Yeah. Yeah. Like I reviewed some books and websites. That's not necessary. Yeah, it's very vague. Yeah, that's very good. Exactly. It's vague. Like, what books did you look at? Were they related to this topic that you're writing a lit review on? Like, what websites were you on? Was it, just some random blogger who's going on a rant about something that has nothing to do with anything? Or is it a credible peer-reviewed journal that you read with a high impact factor? Uh, we see that automation impacts driving behavior, but like what behavior? Does it make you speed? Does it make you take a nap in the trunk of your car? Like what is it changing? We have no insight on that. So yeah, exactly. Vague sources. We want to cite the specific source and we want to find credible sources. That's the other part, is that we don't, want to be citing references that don't have credibility or merit. We don't want to make overgeneralized claims, right? It doesn't name who the researchers are, when they published it. Like, was this published 60 years ago when automation didn't even exist? And like, it was a hypothetical situation. You want to provide some context there. Or what aspect of automation was studied? Was it full supervised, unsupervised? What was that level of automation that they looked at? And then there's no synthesis or analysis, right? You need to reconcile or contextualize those conflicting findings. While you're able to detect more pedestrians, you're slower to respond, right? That is reconciling the conflicting findings. All right, so let's wrap this up with a couple of conclusions. So I presented, a fair amount of information to y'all. So what can you do when you exit this room or close out the Zoom chat? How can you go about, and what are some of those things to keep in mind? The first is that we want to paraphrase and synthesize ideas across multiple sources in your own words. You want to connect studies logically, not just list them. You want to integrate a range of voices to show the scope of research. You want to think critically by analyzing patterns, contradictions, and gaps. And you want to reframe ideas authentically. You want to avoid patch writing and over-reliance on quotes. Right? This kind of gets at one of the questions that was in the chat earlier, right? This plot showing the relationship between, the finding literature that's relevant to your thesis or your research and how that brings joy. And then like you hit this point where you're like, oh my gosh, someone already did this already. And you wouldn't want to do your literature review at the end when you've already, conducted all your research and data collection, and now you have to start over from scratch, right? So a lit review should be, an iterative cycle. You do it at the beginning of the study, make sure that there's merit for it, but then do it again at the end to make sure that, you have current papers, and also, oftentimes the context of your research might change from the beginning to the end, and so you want to make sure you still have relevant supporting references. And why does lit review matter? Again, you want to show you understand the field, not just what others said, but what it means, right? So going back to the quotes, that's why quotes are not ideal, because it doesn't show you understand what it means. It just shows that you can use the copy and paste feature on a keyboard. It helps build credibility and sets up your research contribution. It puts it in the context of why it's important and why someone should maybe give you money to continue answering these research questions or hiring you because you can solve good problems. It helps you craft a clear, focused research question or research argument, and it demonstrates scholarly thinking, not just reporting. Again, you all chose to go to grad school, and so part of that is to demonstrate scholarly thinking and to master that skill. Right? Again, there's endless comics about, finding literature that just shows that your question has already been answered, right? And so we see here, how many references do I need to include? And we have this plot showing the optimal number of references. And if you have too few, people think you're just, making things up and there's no value in your research. But, hitting that point where if you find too many references, people think you're unoriginal, you're just repeating what's already been done. So, really the end of that plot doesn't really come to fruition, but you do want to make sure you're doing novel work and demonstrating how your work is novel. And so my last slide here again is with this, thinking about what the typical flow of a literature review might look like, especially in an introduction or a background section, right? You want to start with a broad introduction. You want to say, hey, safety is a critical concern in transportation and, across all transportation. But I'm only going to be focusing on pedestrians and bicyclists because I can't, solve every problem in one research paper. And here are the key themes and concepts that I'm going to approach it with. Maybe it's, again, like in that first example with emotional intelligence. And if you can train people to have higher emotional intelligence, then there's merit for understanding that connection between emotional intelligence and how drivers interact with bicycles and pedestrians. And then that helps you start to transition to your specific research question. Like, what is that critical gap and how are you trying to answer that? And what is your specific focus? And lastly, what is the rationale for your current study? So with that, thanks everyone for listening, and I would love to open it up if there's any questions that y'all have. Either if you're online, if you want to unmute or use the chat, or in person if you want to raise your hand, all would be accepted. Someone asked, will you be sending out your slides to attendees? We do post the slides and recordings of these sessions on our website. So please, look to the website and you can get this information. Yeah, Joshua.
Regarding I mentioned about putting paper like EMG site in the reference. Something interesting just came to mind was I was having a conversation with someone in my lab, like the journal was submitted to have this space for unsighted references, like references that added the line of book while working on this paper, when we didn't actually cite them. So I thought that was interesting. But my main question is when you're doing research in a space that has not really been researched, and say you only have one or two papers looking at that particular problem from your point of view, and you're trying to, I guess, the first paper you're trying to bring out is to prove that this area is under research. What do the results look like? Review like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So for those online, if you didn't catch that, there's 2 points. The first is that recently put in a paper together where the journal allows for a section of uncited references. So that's interesting. I've never seen that before. So yeah, an opportunity to put papers listed that you didn't reference specifically, but helped you kind of guide towards that research product. So that's an interesting approach. I like that. And then the question though was, what if you're doing really cutting edge work and there just isn't enough literature to populate, those 20 to 30? Like, what do you do? And that's a great question. I would say, there's always something that is somewhat related, usually like a framework that you're leveraging. Maybe it's been used in like maybe some theory you're using has shown merit in other like domains or industries, and you're like, hey, it's never been done in transportation or electric vehicles, but it's worked in other fields, so why don't we try it here? Or, it's like setting the stage for why it's important. So, maybe if it's in the context of electric vehicles, sure, maybe no one has looked at equity in charging infrastructure, but maybe you can be like look how many electric vehicles there are. There's this number of electric vehicles. We are, pushing the limits on the grid's capacity. There's all these pockets without it, right? Like usually you can find something that helps support it. And yeah, sometimes you can just say there really isn't literature to the best of the researcher's knowledge or the best of the author's knowledge that specifically answers that. And I've done that before in a paper, but sometimes the introduction is also just to demonstrate that you can look to the literature and interpret and understand the meaning, and that something you did has some merit and some need in the world. Yeah. Someone says, do you have any thoughts on how to best approach peer-reviewed versus non-peer reviewed sources in a literature review? Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I try to populate most of my literature review with like peer-reviewed journals or technical reports. But sometimes, right, someone has really good information on a newspaper, right, website or a magazine or a website that didn't go through a peer-reviewed process. And so there's not necessarily that, robustness that it was checked by experts in the field before it was put out there. I think sometimes a couple of those is fine, but I would definitely, lean towards finding, the vast majority and the like one or two that you just can't get away from is fine for sure. But I think that also tends to be a style preference maybe of the advisor. So maybe your advisor, depending on what your area of, application is, maybe some non-peer reviewed references have more merit than others. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I guess.
Yeah.
So what's the common sense of Disney citation?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And the question for those online, it's like, where's the line of what needs a citation versus what's common sense? And that can be hard. Like sometimes I would err on the side of just citing too much and then in the revision like start to pull it out if you're like this really is overly obvious. I think usually if you could ask like a junior high or high school student and if they know the answer pretty easily, like maybe that's a good metric. Yeah, it's really like, and if you think of who your target audience is, that can help as well. But yeah, that's always a good question that I don't necessarily have the best answer for. Someone asked, what's a good target percentage for the literature review section in your thesis or dissertation? Yeah, so yeah, that is a good question. I mean, I would say if I did a dissertation that's 150 pages long, which I think is pretty representative, I would probably want, 10 to 20 pages, maybe 10 to 15 pages that provides it. And again, that's, double spaced and with section headers and maybe some pictures thrown in. But again, I would say probably 100 references tends to be what that mix looks like, at least in the application space that my students do. But that also means some of those are going into your discussion section as well, right? It doesn't all go into the introduction. Someone said, is the only part of a journal article, dissertation, thesis that is truly your words, thoughts are the data collection, results, and conclusion sections? Yeah, I mean, you want the introduction to be strung together with your own thoughts and logic and being supported by references. But yeah, very rarely is the methods section going to contain references. And, I would say the results should definitely not contain references. That should go in your methods or your intro. And again, methods really shouldn't, but if, it's a statistical method that really needs that reference, right? You can put that in your methods. And then, yeah, the conclusion section, if you have a discussion and then a separate conclusion, you want the conclusion to be your own words. And yeah, the discussion to predominantly be your own words and synthesis of the results, but then supported by how your findings relate to the literature. But yeah, I like that perspective on it. Then this last question in the chat, it appears that the author's interpretation will already be in the discussion and conclusion. Maybe I'm stating the obvious, but what are your thoughts on how the author cites a fact based on their own professional experience or observation? Yeah, I think that kind of goes back to the point. It's like what's common sense or understood in that area of expertise. And I think, you want to show that you're not just making things up, and that there's some merit, and other people have provided examples. Maybe like going back to Dixie's example that water is important, and that people need access to water. And then maybe it's like, and here's a paper that demonstrates why water is important, or what happens when you have, poor water quality, right? Providing some example can help as well. But yeah, it's definitely a balancing act. Like, yeah, I rewrite my literature reviews over and over again. And I will read a paper that's been published and I'm like, oh man, that wasn't the best lit review, right? Like, but the point is that you're always supposed to be improving and getting better, and you're not going to get it right on the first shot. Yeah.
Following up on what you said about common sense, I know our common sense literature is where maybe I write something, then during the review, you're like, well, in my mind, this is common sense.
Mm-hmm.
You have to find certain.
Yeah.
Kind of reverse. I feel like I'm now searching for
Yeah.
any paper.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Just like the dissertation. But the other question I was going to ask is, the example you gave, like on study about human beings responding faster to emergency and growth, something like that goes human behavior changes over time. The better the technology gets, the more people trust it. So I was looking at that example. The first person that was cited in like 2007 study that said it's better. In 2004, study said it's not better. In situations like that, considering that we know that these things are changing, especially because it involves human behavior, is it okay to like go back and cite an older paper in a time when technology was not so developed?
Yeah.
It's the new one.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question for those online is, pointed out that this is a very dated example where the quotes are from 2005, 7, and 4. Yeah, and I thought about just changing these numbers for the example here because I agree this is outdated. I think this was from this might have been an example that I put together for like when I was a grad student actually. And so when I was a grad student, these were more topical examples. But yeah, like that's one of the reasons in text citations has, generally dates so that people are like, oh yeah, you've been looking at papers that have been published in the past, usually, 10 years, but with emphasis on the past 5 years for sure. Yeah. So good. I think this is definitely, a dated example, and you should be looking at recent technology unless, I have a student who's looking at, doing some work with the displays for, lunar exploration, and people haven't really done a lot in the past like 30 years. And so in that case, she does have some papers that are dated because they still hold some merit. But yeah, depends. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
people are confident, so that.
Yeah.
That is cool. This is what people are saying.
I would probably say so if I was writing a dissertation on this, I would look for literature that was in the past 10 years, but then maybe I would have a paragraph and say, in previous iterations of technology or when technology was new, like if you still want to show that. But if I was a reviewer of a journal and there was a paper that was submitted like this, I would say the authors need to find more current literature because this is not acceptable. And I did that recently with the paper that I was reviewing. There was references from, I think, like, nothing newer than 2015. And I was like, go back to the drawing board. Yeah. Yeah, in front.
So going back to like the solar energy
Yeah.
example. So in that situation, it would be very easy to also cite EIA data that's, government data publicly reported, but it doesn't have any context per se. Is that copacetic in a lit review setting, or do you really want to find someone who's done some amount of editorializing on that in the form of a review paper?
Yeah, I mean, again, it really depends on who your target audience is and what the industry is. So, like, the government puts together reliable information, historically. And so, right, like, so that would be an accepted source. There's like a .gov report. And so that would be fine. Like census information, it's not peer reviewed, right? But it has credibility. If it's from, like a magazine that, is just a periodical that who knows what the background is, like you probably want to find something a little bit better. But yeah, there are caveats to only looking for peer reviewed papers. Good question. Was there another one behind? Yeah, please.
Actually, in line with what you have just asked,
Please.
using up on the question of limited peer review material, and where you only only materials from the government in form of legislation or probably policies, as well as maybe industry guidance, something like that. I was wondering if that could be the source of your as foundational material for your research in the absence of or a rather academically peer reviewed materials. Because I'm seeing governments do consult citizens, industries also do consult maybe their stakeholders. So is it something you can base your research to build up new knowledge?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think you are also an expert in the area you're writing a paper on or doing the research in, so you can provide that like critical eye. Like, do you think it's reputable based on what the source is? I think, usually, yeah, technical reports from companies or government entities, especially if they have a method section, you can see, like, was it a robust methods that they came up with these conclusions? Or yeah, is it just like the executive sitting in, his suite and not, doing a good review? So yeah, I think it really just depends also what the application area is. So we are at time. So I will close this, but I put my email address up here. I'm happy to continue this conversation with anyone. Also, all the other professors in our department are also well versed in this. So, feel free to reach out to your advisor too. They can provide that expertise as well. But I'm happy to have those conversations. So thanks everyone. Appreciate your guys' engagement. And yeah, keep in touch.
Thanks, Dr. Gallegos. That was great.